The first big step forward for civil rights came in 1954, and that is that landmark case that I hope you've heard of called Brown versus Board of Education. Actually, the long name is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, but we tend to just call it Brown v. Board or Brown versus Board of Education. And how this case came about is that starting in about 1944, the Supreme Court started applying strict scrutiny to any state laws that had some type of racial criteria. In other words, if there was a state law saying that there needed to be separate waiting rooms in a hospital for African Americans and for white people, the state would have to show that there was a compelling reason for that type of separation. Remember, that's what strict scrutiny means, that the government needs to show that there is some type of compelling interest or compelling reason. So there were some small cases that came about, some small victories for civil rights, and then finally the landmark case in 1954, the decision comes down in Brown versus Board of Education. And what the court ultimately decides in that case is that separate but equal, that doctrine that was set up in Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate but equal is unconstitutional. So Brown versus Board of Education completely overturns Plessy versus Ferguson and finds that racial segregation in schools is unconstitutional. So this is a huge step forward for civil rights in the United States. The next big step forward comes through civil rights legislation. The first is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the next is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlaws racial segregation and other forms of discrimination. Now, the reason that Congress needed to act in order to outlaw racial segregation, even though the Supreme Court found that racial segregation is unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education, is because the states said, we're just not going to listen to that Supreme Court. And they dragged their feet on desegregating. Remember, the Supreme Court has no power to enforce their decisions. So ultimately, Congress also needed to act in order to desegregate schools and other public places. So in 1964, they passed the Civil Rights Act, which outlaws racial segregation and other forms of discrimination. They required equal application to voter registration requirements. In other words, they found that everybody should be able to register to vote equally. And it also prohibits discrimination in hiring practices. So these are the three big things that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. And this does two really important things. Number one, it prohibits states from imposing poll taxes and literacy tests. And then the second thing that it does, which is really important, is that it gives the federal government the authority to watch over all of the election practices in states that formerly had voter disenfranchisement policies. So, for example, a state like Texas that had policies in place in order to prevent African Americans to vote, if Texas wanted to change anything about how it was going to run an election, it needed to check with the federal government first. And the federal government would look at the change that Texas wanted to make, and it could either say, yes, you can do that, or no, you cannot do that. So we call this federal oversight. In other words, the federal government is watching over what the states were doing. So these are some huge steps forward for the civil rights movement. So 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965.